Let's talk about the birth of capitalism. Capitalism is a system that was born in fire and violence and repression. Let's talk, in other words, about the first chapter of Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. We are back for the second video on Caliban and the Witch. If you haven't gotten a chance yet, I recommend you go back and watch that intro lecture that I put out there. That's just going to take you through some of the necessary stuff that you need to know before you go in to read this book, or need is a strong word. That would be helpful for you to know things about Marx's primitive capital accumulation ideas and Michel Foucault's biopower ideas that can serve as kind of the foundation for what's going to come in these later chapters and for the rest of this book. But if you're just jumping in here, this is actually not a terrible place to start, because this is Federici kind of building a foundation that she's going to jump off of for the rest of this book. And especially it's going to be very, very important when we come later to things like chapter 4, where we talk about the great witch hunt across Europe and many more things. So this is actually a perfect jumping off point. The fun thing about these first two chapters specifically is that there's actually not a lot of theory that you need to know to jump into it. There's just a lot of history. And in the first two chapters, and about 139 pages if you're in the Penguin Modern Classics version, she's going to try to sum up about 200-300 years worth of history, and that's kind of fun. And before I get into the roadmap, just a quick reminder as well, if you get a chance, please check out the Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. I've got all of these books. We've done things like Manufacturing Consent and The Wretched of the Earth, some big titanic books out there. So Caliban and the Witch is not the only one, and you can find all of those on the Patreon channel, as well as much more stuff. And if you are already a subscriber on Patreon, thank you so much. I love that this main feed series is freely available to anybody who wants it, and your support on that Patreon channel really helps make this happen. So thank you so much for being there and for supporting all of this. I really appreciate it. Let's get into the roadmap though. Now, there is a lot to talk about in this chapter and a lot more to talk about in the second chapter as well. But for this first chapter, I'm breaking it down into 4 sections roughly. In the first one, we're going to talk, here we go, about the commons. So Federici considers the commons to be incredibly important. What were the commons and what did it look like back then? We'll talk about that. Second part, we're going to tackle the heretics and the heretic and millenarian movements which are occurring at the time. The third thing that we're going to talk about is the Black Death, one of the most consequential things to happen in human history, probably, and definitely in European history. So we'll talk about the Black Death and what it caused, what it meant for the workers living in Europe at the time. And then finally, we're going to finish off with sexual politics and the rise of the state. Those are the 4 sections for today. The thing that you need to know jumping into this chapter is that this chapter is mostly concerned with setting the scene for what's going to come in the second chapter. The second chapter is where we get to all of the stuff about primitive capital accumulation and biopower, the origins of early biopower. And the second chapter is probably the toughest to get through. It's certainly the longest in this book. We will get to all of that next week, but this chapter is really about setting the scene. We're talking about the feudal period. Feudalism, of course, we went through this last time, but feudalism is one lord and then serfs that work their own lands around that lord and then work the lord's lands. Of course, it is much more complicated than that. We'll get into that in a sec, but this is, as far as Federici is concerned, setting the scene, right? The chapter is called All the World Needs a Jolt. It's about this period of time before everything starts to collapse and erupt and just change in these really, really titanic, Federici in the second chapter says, apocalyptic ways. So we're setting the scene today, and let's get into it, and let's start with the commons. Or in other words, let's start with the land. Because before capitalism could take root, it had to tear out kind of the beating heart of feudal society, and that beating heart of feudal society was the commons. Let's not paint too rosy a picture of the commons here or of the feudal period. Federici is very careful not to do this either, but there are many ways in which the feudal and the pre-capitalist society in general was more empowered than what came later. And by the way, when we talk about the feudal period, we are normally talking about the year 1000 to the early 1600s, so the 9th to the 15th centuries. There's this big stretch of time which is different across a lot of Europe, and one of the main things that people complain about, if they complain about Federici, is the way that she homogenizes all of this European history together. Of course, different things are happening in different countries. This is a period of hundreds of years as well. So, of course, context is going to matter a lot when you talk about these events and when you talk about the particular countries. But anyway, broadly what we're talking about is the year 1000 to 1600, although, as we will talk about, the Age of Discovery, as it is normally called, which kicks off with Columbus at the end of the 1400s, 1492, is going to change basically everything. Anyway, let's talk about the commons. Now, we have this image of a society in feudalism as plague-ridden, it's muddy, it's impoverished, it's sort of a Monty Python Holy Grail situation, right? And we have this image of laboring peasants under a dominating lord. And that's, of course, not completely off. Plenty of disease, plenty of poverty, plenty of subsistence agriculture, and a powerful lord at the top of things, and workers weren't terribly happy, but it's more complicated than that. There's a lot more to it. And the first image that we have to combat is this image of the passive European peasant. The European peasants at the time were not passive at all. They resisted military drafts. They avoided taxes that they saw as unnatural. They frequently withdrew labor en masse, kind of a proto-strike, when the demands became unreasonable. And this is very important, they fought tooth and nail over access to the commons. So what were the commons? Well, the commons were land and resources that were shared communally. They were accessible by anybody within that community to use. And Federici, in a lot of her subsequent work, has urged a return to the commons. That's something we'll talk about a lot more later, but the commons weren't a utopia, and Federici is very clear about this. They were, however, a system that was rooted in customary rights and collective use. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about Murray Bookchin's work, The Ecology of Freedom, fairly recently, but crucially for Federici, the commons gave women a kind of autonomy that would later be violently stripped away. That is a process that takes centuries to happen, and that's because, unlike what was to come over the later coming centuries and the capitalist systems that were about to come kind of later on, the feudal economy was very centered on the household. Labor at this time in a lot of Europe was collective, and kind of wives and husbands worked side by side. Women weren't just working, alongside their male labor. Their contributions were literally woven into the fabric of society at the time. And in some ways, Federici puts this argument out there, women during this feudal period were more independent than they would be for hundreds of years afterwards. Because, of course, under the feudal system, they're still subject to the patriarchy and exploitation and all of this, but they are not yet rendered economically invisible, which is what comes after. But to come back to the commons, if you're a feudal lord, this is a really, really dangerous thing. Because think about this, the commons is a system that's based on equal treatment and access for all, not in an idealistic way, just in a practical way. The commons were a means for people to exist completely independently of whatever lord was off there over yonder. This particular period that Silvia Federici starts with in this chapter is also before the time of cash rents. So it is labor power that you have to donate to the lord. You work your own land. You get to do whatever you want to do with this land, this commons. You get to access that, and then you have to go and work a little bit on your lord's land. And there's actually a level of struggle that's kind of embedded into that because peasants are fighting back at literally every level. Federici Federici, for example, tells a really fabulous story of peasants exploiting kind of legal requirements and these legal loopholes. So in one story that she tells, peasants were required to collect hay in one place and stack it in another, and the peasants pointed out that they were not legally required to transport it from one place to the other. So, they could collect it, but then how are they going to stack it over there? There's no transportation. It's kind of funny. But it is a system that's being constantly negotiated from below. And because of that, the feudal lords and the nobility and the powers of the time had to do something about the commons. There was, in the first place, the commutation of services, which is, instead of labor, now you pay cash rents. That's a different type of feudalism. And it ends up that this commutation of services creates a split in the peasant classes below it. So now you have rich peasants and poor peasants that can kind of get out of different obligations depending on their level of wealth. So within this rigid class society, you have new classes emerging. And remember, one of the ways that capitalism perpetuates its power is divide and conquer tactics. And you're kind of seeing this start to happen. Much later on, and we're going to talk about this much more next week, but you have enclosure. And this happens in a few ways. In England, you actually literally have formal enclosure laws, which basically end up closing off public access to public land. And through this process, you have an eventual death of the commons. So people get pushed off of the commons and into new towns, and new social orders start forming and taking shape. We will get to there, but for now, in Caliban and the Witch, the commons are a source of power, a source of independent peasant power. Is that enough plosives for this microphone? We'll find out. But let's move on from the commons and the idea of the commons and talk about the heretics. For the heretics, I'm about to present you with a picture that's absolutely shocking. Get this, a world in which women can preach, they can baptize, and they can live communally with men without getting married. That's crazy, right? That's heresy. That's insanity. Well, yeah, kind of. The word heresy, the modern day usage of the word heresy, it is specific, but it's also sort of laden with a bunch of definitions that we use pretty liberally to apply to a bunch of things. But this is a specific movement that we are referring to in this case, the heretic movement, or actually a series of radical movements that popped up through this feudal period. Now, we've talked about a couple of heretical and especially millenarian movements when we did our series on the ecology of freedom. But basically, we're talking about a bunch of radical movements that were organized and often fully fledged heretical sects that were actively building alternative bases of power, alternative communities, in other words, and they were backing those communities with force, with arms and weapons. The millenarian version of these, so the preoccupation with the end of the world, the millenarian version of these was often spontaneous uprisings that were responding to the brutal conditions that they were living through at the time. And they were frequently inspired by kind of visions and prophecies. But Federici wants to talk quite specifically about the Cathars. Now, the Cathars were a medieval Gnostic sect. And we talked a little bit about the Gnostic movements. There are several waves of Gnostic movements. When we talked about the Gnostics in the sense that Murray Bookchin was talking about them, we talked about the first century Gnostics. We talked about some ancient Gnostic movements. We're moving from the ancient period to the medieval period. So these are not the Gnostics of Murray Bookchin. These are later Gnostics. Gnostics, if you remember, they are preoccupied with the acquisition of spiritual knowledge. So not something that is told to you by a priest or a preacher, but something that you acquire yourself. It's an individual form of spiritual knowledge that comes around in a process that they refer to as gnosis, which is where we get the word Gnostic. Anyway, the Cathars in the medieval period, they are preaching that, well, since Christ owned nothing, why should the church? They did everything from condemning war to refusing to kill animals. And interestingly, they also rejected procreation. Now, it seems to be that was more for the spiritual elite than the rest of the Cathars. If you wanted to be sort of spiritually pure, you would reject procreation. But it can be seen, and Federici throws this idea out there, that maybe this is a return to the female ownership of the female body and the reproductive system. And crucially, crucially, the Cathars were also elevating women to a level that they just didn't have in the formal church in any meaningful sense. Women, for example, could hold religious roles. They could teach, they could heal, they could speak, and some lived with men freely outside of marriage. So this is heretical. This is absolute heresy in the eyes of the church, and it's also dangerous. Now, when we think about the millenarian movements and the heretics, the heretical sects that popped up across Europe, sometimes they're kind of tolerated, right? These are powerful power bases, and it is tough to get rid of them. So in some cases in medieval history, they're kind of dealt with as kind of, yeah, we would prefer that these didn't exist, but they sort of have to exist. Let's leave them where they are for now and just kind of tolerate them and kind of try to sort of wrap them into the system. In other places, however, and this is what Federici is arguing here, they were crushed quickly. The Cathars, literally, at one point, the Pope sends a crusade to go and crush the Cathars. They are that dangerous. And later on, they're actually massacred in what is generally considered to be a religious genocide. The other big example of this is the Münster Rebellion. Now, we'll get to this in a second, but after the bubonic plague, after the Black Death, Europe is left reeling. It is left without workers. And suddenly, in the mid-1300s to late 1300s, workers gain a substantial amount of power, just literally because there are so many fewer workers out there. And suddenly, because of that, the womb and the female reproductive system isn't just a part of the female anatomy. Now it is an important tool for the state and for the powerful to rebuild Europe. So when you come around to the worker rebellions that later take place, the German Peasants' War, and especially the Münster Rebellion, the Münster Rebellion is an attempt by Anabaptists in the German town of Münster to establish an independent commune and an independent power base off in the city of Münster, and they are absolutely crushed. This is, by the way, shortly after the German Peasants' War that ends in 1525. So this is about 10 years after the German Peasants' War. The city is laid under siege. 3,000 plus people die. The leaders are tortured to death and hung from cages around the city so that people can see. It doesn't end well for the Anabaptists that try to raise this independent power struggle. But this is something that the European powers have to do at this point. If they want to retain their power, they have to, we'll talk about the sexual politics of this, but they have to control the female population, and they have to crush any workers that stand in their way. Any kind of worker power bases that are arising from these early Gnostic, millenarian, and heretical movements, they must be crushed, especially in the wake of the Black Death. Let's talk about the Black Death, though. So in around 1347, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, arrives in Europe and everything changes. The plague, depending on which historical source you ask, it wipes out between a third and half of the European population. It is like wildfire. Fields are abandoned, cities are emptied. The old world basically cracked in half, and something new came after. For a moment, the thing that was new that came after was new power, especially for Europe's workers, as Europe's burgeoning proletariat. They threatened to emerge from these cracks in the old world. This is dangerous for Europe's nobility, it's dangerous for Europe's land-owning class, and it's especially dangerous for the church, right? The church claims knowledge of life and death, and all of a sudden, so many people are dead that the fear of taboo starts to disappear. People no longer obey the church's moral rules and just because they're told to. Sexual prohibitions, hierarchies, the obligations that the church puts on people, all of these start to lose their power. And of course, most importantly, labor is becoming very, very scarce at this point. That scarcity actually empowers the working class. There are so many people dead that the peasants, the day laborers, they find themselves very in demand. And with that demand, they can start to refuse rents. They can walk off the land. They can demand wages. And in some cases, they even won. By the end of the 14th century, serfdom, the idea of feudalism itself, is very, very close to fully collapsing. This old feudal order, because of the bubonic plague and because of just the sheer number of people that have died, is threatening to collapse. So The powers of Europe at the time have to act, and they have to act very quickly. But before they can act to crush the peasant class, there is a golden age of opportunity that comes around right after the Black Death. So you have things like the Peasant Revolt of 1381. In France, there are whole regions that are rising up in protest. In Spain, you see a wave of peasant wars across Aragon. And this isn't kind of isolated. This is a social earthquake. That's probably the best way to think about this. In terms of power, this is what Federici calls the golden age of the European proletariat. There's a brief window of time where the poor are pushing back, and they're kind of winning for a little bit. But revolutions provoke counter-revolutions, and that's exactly what happened. So in England, for example, they try to impose a maximum wage. You've heard of a minimum wage. This is a maximum wage. They just don't want to pay workers that much, and so they try the maximum wage. And that provokes things like the Peasant Revolt of 1381 that we just talked about. Elites are scrambling to rebuild their control. They're doing it through any means they possibly can, especially force. And behind the scenes, as Europe's nobility and aristocracy is trying to rebuild their elite power, you have the emergence of something that is going to provide, you have the emergence of new forms of power that are going to provide the basis for the capitalism that's going to come. Feudalism is starting to die already. Now, it takes a long time to die, but we start to see the early seeds of the death of feudalism in this period right after the Black Death. And we're going to come back to this idea actually because you can compare and contrast a little bit what happened with the Black Death and the end of workers there and the end of the slave trade, which happens much later. We'll talk about this in the second chapter. But for the Caribbean colonies, when the slave trade ends, all of a sudden the enslaved people, this flow of enslaved people from Africa that the landowning class in these colonies could rely on, that started to look like it was going to dry up. And so they had to control the enslaved sexuality of the people living on the islands there. Just like they had to do that in the Caribbean colonies, they now had to do that in Europe. If you are looking at workers not being there to farm your lands anymore, well, all of a sudden it's time to start controlling the means of reproduction. So let's talk a little bit about that now. Let's leave the Black Death and talk now about sexual politics and the rise of the state. Most of the important parts of this chapter center around this idea, right? This is the elites reasserting their power in the wake of the Black Death, and they start to focus on a familiar target, and that target is women. This is the rise of gendered violence across Europe. With this, we're starting to get to the crux of Federici's argument in this book, which is that capitalism and the capitalist mode of production is built on subjugated bodies of women. So there's a lot of history that goes into this, and we'll talk much more about this in the second chapter, but let's talk about the bedrock, sort of the basis for what happens next. And let's start with the church. The church has always seen sexuality as incredibly dangerous, especially in the ways that it gave women power over men. So they launched what amounted to a war on women, a war to strip power away from women. Enter the famous penitentials. The penitentials were church handbooks that were very specifically spelling out what kind of sex was allowed, what positions, how, with whom, and how often. Sodomy was criminalized, and reproductive authority became a moral and a legal matter. Basically, what you have here is sex becoming a matter for the state. And this is a deliberate political strategy, right? This is after the Black Death, the working class had gained a lot of political power. So the state, the lords, the church, the elites had to find new and innovative ways to divide and discipline the bodies that were under their control. In France, for example, rape itself was decriminalized. And across Europe, male violence against women is normalized, it's tolerated, and it's rising. It's often even encouraged by elite power. And all of this is a means to subjugate women, to keep women in their place. You have anti-female violence seen as a solution to rebellion and to social instability. As a strategy, this is kind of brilliant, and it pops up in a number of different effects. One of those is the way the state started to institutionalize prostitution. All of a sudden, prostitution is seen as something of a public good. We'll talk about the state shifting hard on this when they start to criminalize prostitution in later centuries. But early on, this becomes a way to deal with people who are just too rebellious, right? Instead of allowing them to create power bases for workers, why not just get them to attack women? The divide and conquer strategy, but on a gendered level. So across Europe, you have brothels that are legalized, they are regulated, and in many cities, they're actually run by municipal authorities. And they're seen as a way to prevent sodomy and male desire. But it's also a way to commodify women. Prostitution essentially became a public service. And behind all of this, the legal rape, the state-run sex trade, the new religious rules for restricted human sexuality, behind all of this is this new alliance that starts to emerge around this period of time between the nobility, the church, and the new class of bourgeoisie that is starting to appear. And of course, this new bourgeoisie will start to emerge over the next century in Europe, especially as conquest and capital starts to flow back to the metropole. So this isn't just a piece in the story of capitalism, the extra part of Marx's primitive accumulation. It's actually kind of beyond that. And this is what Federici is putting forward with her argument here. This is a calculated and a state-driven way to destroy the power of women, and to destroy the power of sex itself. We talked about biopower in the intro lecture. This is the state seizing reproduction itself, a staggering sort of biopower. But we'll talk a lot more about this when we get into the second chapter. I keep saying this about the second chapter, but these two chapters are tied so tightly together. It's really tough to talk about one without talking about the other, but we'll get into all of this, and it's probably better that we split all of this information across two videos anyway, so we'll get into that next week. For now, I will leave it here with you today. Let me know what you think about all of this. Are you, for example, convinced by Federici's analysis of the way that the early history of this period changed the structure and course of the world? Does this change the way that you see things? Does this change anything about the way that you view modern society? When I was writing up the notes for the Black Death, for example, I started to think about COVID and the modern parallels there. There's actually a lot to be said, both in terms of parallels and the way we've departed from this kind of old school model. The way worker power was undercut even in the wake of another global pandemic. It's really, really interesting. Anyway, thank you, as always, for watching these videos. If you're a Patreon subscriber, thank you so much for being there. Let me know what you think about any and all of this, and I will be back next week to talk about the longest chapter in this book, which is, of course, the accumulation of labor and the degradation of women. We'll be back next time, and I will see you then. Thank you.